Well, good morning. Today and this year, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of our university. But today, I want to talk about another anniversary, and that's the 40th anniversary of the 1974 Working Women's Charter. I bet nobody in this room has heard of that charter. So by the end of this, you will know about the charter, and you'll know why we need a new one. So, the Charter is a list of 10 demands drawn up by women from around the country in the 1970s to try and bridge the gulf between the lives of working men and working women. Before I get into that in more detail, I need to take you back to 1974. My slide says there, women on the up. They certainly were. Life was changing dramatically for women in the UK and around the world by the mid-1970s. This picture you may recognize. There's a group of university students, women university students, sitting on top of one of our iconic tower blocks. No safety rail in sight. It's the kind of picture that would give, induce a kind of health and safety heart attack these days. But I love it. I absolutely love it, and I'll tell you why. I love it because it's full of promise. It's full of promise on two counts. They're new students breaking new ground at a new university, and we all know what amazing things this university's done in the last 50 years. They're also a new generation of young women who are breaking the mold. They're stepping out from the constraints that had dogged the lives of their mothers and grandmothers. Now, those constraints is something that I'm particularly interested in, and as Todd said in his introduction, I've made two BBC documentaries about them, one on the history of servants in Britain and one on the history of shop workers. I had a very personal interest in those topics because my great-grandmothers were servants and my grandmothers were shop workers. So I was very interested in tracing the constraints that they faced and how they gradually shook them off. But let me take you to 1974 in my family. In 1974, I was 4. I'm now 44, clearly. And my mum was going back to work for the first time after 10 years, having stayed at home for those 10 years, looking after 3 children. She was able to go back to work, 1973-74, because her mother, my grandmother, came to live with us and came to look after me and my 2 sisters, but also because my dad was very, very hands-on, and that allowed her to go back to work, not just part-time, but full-time. It also allowed her the time to study as a mature student. So things were changing in our family too in the mid-1970s. I think my mum and maybe your mothers, grandmothers were part of a quiet revolution at that time. The figure of the working mother is very familiar to us today, but she's actually a very new figure in the labour market landscape. Working women have been around forever, of course, but working mothers doing paid work outside the home is a relatively recent historical phenomenon, starting in earnest in Britain in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. That the moment they appeared on the scene, they changed the political landscape, not just the labour market landscape, but the political landscape as well. And the reason they did that was because they threw up a new set of political challenges. And we're still grappling with those challenges today, very much so. So the Charter, the Working Women's Charter in 1974, was one of the first attempts really to try and grapple with that. So let's take a look at it and let's see what it was demanding, the 10 demands. Equal pay for equal work, equal opportunities, regardless of marital status. It's really up until the 50s and 60s, women traditionally gave up work on marriage, not because it was the law, but because they felt they ought to. So equal opportunities regardless of marital status, equal access to education and training, equal working conditions, and this was a case of levelling up to men, not bringing men's working conditions down through lower pay and poorer conditions and so on. Equal legal rights. Can you imagine a situation where, as a working woman, you wouldn't be allowed to get a mortgage in your own right without some sort of male guarantor? So this is the kind of situation that was going on in the 70s. Equal legal rights for women. Free childcare. A brave hope indeed, and we'll be certainly returning to that towards the end of the talk. More paid maternity leave and job security, pensions and promotions for working mothers. So it wasn't just a case of women coming back to work after children, but progressing up the labour market chain. Free contraception and abortion. What you have to remember there is that abortion was illegal until 1967 in the UK. It was still hard for many women to access abortion and contraception, even some years on from that act. So that's why that demand was in there. Increased family allowances, more women in public and political life. Now, this is a document straight out of the women's movement. It came out of second wave feminism. As you can see, it blends the personal and the political. Second wave feminists believed that you couldn't separate these two things, that what happened in public life and in the workplace was intimately connected to what went on at home and in the family. And they were right, believe me. Now, who were the women that drew this up? They were trades unionists and members of trades councils. Women civil servants were very active in drawing this up. It was a London-based movement, but it became much bigger, and local charter groups were set up around the country, all 40 years ago. So it's full of promise. It's full of promise, this. I'd like to invite you to look at that list and see how many of those things you think have been achieved 40 years on. Can I have a quick show of hands? Does anyone think all 10 have been achieved? No. Anyone think maybe half, roughly? A few more. Okay. Well, that's what I want to think about now. But bear that thought in mind. Its impact was lessened, unfortunately, by the fact that the TUC, the Trades Union Congress in Britain, the organisation that stands up for workers of all kinds, rejected the Charter in its conference of 1975. Now, that's a long story and a complicated story, and beyond the time I've got here. In short, there were two big issues. One was that they didn't want to back the Charter's demand for a minimum wage for women as a means of securing equal pay for women. But the other reason was they didn't want to get entangled, as they saw it, in issues around reproductive rights and so on. So, as you can see there, Women's Charter falls by the wayside, Women's Charter defeated. That's from 1975. But my interest today, and what I want to engage you with really, is how far we've come with those 10 demands. Most of you gave it about half. I give it 40 years on. I give it 4 out of 10. And that's quite poor. That's very poor when you think about all the things that have happened to women in that time. I think the things where we can say, tick, job done, very clear. Equal access to education and training. Equal legal rights. The issue of contraception and abortion, not always entirely resolved, but still far, far better than it was. And increased family allowances. So we can say very clearly, tick, job done on those 4, which obviously still leaves 6 to go. Now, if we take the ones at the top, equal pay, it's still an issue in the sense that there's a huge gender pay gap between men and women. So even when people are doing equal work, say even lecturers in a university, you can have different scales of lecturer pay, and you'll find possibly that women are more concentrated towards the bottom. Equal opportunities, I've added there regardless of parental status, because it seems to me it's not so much marital status that's the issue now, but certainly parental status is. And many women feel that they are unable to progress as they would like after they've had children. Equal working conditions. I think we are now facing a race to the bottom with things like 0 hours contracts and below living wages. So where women are coming into lots of part-time work, that it's now becoming more of a race to the bottom in terms of some working conditions. Affordable childcare. My mother was lucky enough to have my grandmother at home living with us. When I had my own 2 children, who are now 10 and 12, I was paying around £20,000 a year for childcare. And I think I see a lot of the women in the audience slightly gasping at that. That's a lot of money. That was more, way more, than the wages of the nursery staff who were looking after them as well. So not only was I paying a huge amount of money, but the actual nursery staff could not afford to send their children on the whole to similar provisions. So we're in this kind of very difficult situation. Job security, pensions and promotions for working mothers. big issue, as I'm going to talk about in a second. More women in public and political life. Okay, now you've probably gathered, I'm a feminist, yes. I'm a working mother, yes. I have an axe to grind, absolutely. But don't take my word for this. PricewaterhouseCoopers draws up very regularly a Women in Work index, and I suggest you check this out. When it drew one up in 2013, it ranks OECD countries in order according to various variables. So the position and a number of women in the labour market, the gender pay gap, promotion of women, that sort of thing. 5 key variables they look at. You might think that the UK would be ranked quite highly in that index. It's ranked 18 out of 27 OECD countries on those variables and those indicators. If we take that bottom one, more women in public and political life, there are some very shocking statistics to be had. Women in Westminster. Less than a quarter of MPs are women. Less than a fifth of peers are women. This is a century after women were given the vote, or gained the vote, fought for the vote. In local government, about a third of local councillors are women, and about 10% of council leaders are women. So even at the local level, it's not, in fact, it's a slightly worse picture there in terms of council leadership. In the boardroom, 17% of women, 17% of, let me start that again. FTSE 100 companies, 17% of them have women on their boards. This is very poor. Universities, 14% of UK universities have a woman vice-chancellor. That's a staggering statistic in a sector that's much more equal than you might think a FTSE 100 company might be. So, what do we do with this? We need a new charter. And we need a new charter, I would say now, for that very obvious reason. These 4 gentlemen are competing for our votes and competing to become the next Prime Minister. Now, as many of you here are political scientists, I think, and you will know that the swing vote of women often decides elections. So I think women should vote for their interests. Which of these 4 will deliver a platform, a programme for women that will allow us to kind of do better than 4 out of 10 over the next 40 years? I'm not going to be drawn on which ones you think might do that, but I would be interested to know what Nigel Farage has to say on matters around the Working Women's Charter. I've drawn up 4 demands for the 2015 election, and there's only 4 here, because I want you to think about what the other 5, 6, 7 might be. We need a new Working Women's Charter, I think. Not because a list on its own is going to solve anything, not because the list on its own is going to deliver the change that we need. We need a change of culture, not just a change of law and legislation. But here are my 4. A living wage for all workers, including women workers, and a closing of the gender pay gap, a determined effort to do that. Affordable childcare. Cost of childcare is outstripping any rise in wages at the moment. It's becoming an absolutely untenable situation. We are going backwards in time on that. A better deal for working carers, because obviously caring responsibilities extend beyond young children. And this old chestnut, more women in public life, politics, and the boardroom, whether that's through building confidence or whether that's through quotas, but some kind of concerted action on that. Now, you might like to add your others as you go out. You might think, well, you know, isn't it just up to women to pull their finger out and get on with it and to step forward and just to, whatever they're supposed to do, step up, lean in, and all these other management guru poses that we're supposed to adopt? And isn't it just up to us to seize the opportunities that are there for the taking? After all, 100 years ago, women were actually banned from many professions and banned from public life in the sense of, you know, not having access to the vote, not being able to stand for office, and so on. So, of course, women do need to change their own attitude, I think, to these kinds of things, but they also need the support of others. And old cultures clearly die hard. This is why we need a concerted effort for change. I have to end with the idea, well, I have to end with a comment on that astounding news story from last week from the US. Did you hear this one? Facebook and Apple are offering to fund the freezing of the eggs of their women employees. So if you're a woman and you want to get on well at Apple or Facebook, you can have your eggs frozen in your late 20s, pop them in the freezer. Nobody talks about the difficulty of the actual physical agony of harvesting such things. And then, when you're ready, you've got the right partner, you can defrost them, have your child, and so on, and you needn't put your career on hold. Now, Twitter's gone mad on that story. It's an astounding story, and has it really come to that? I would say, as working women, we don't need our eggs frozen. We need a serious manifesto for social change, and what we need is a new Working Women's Charter. Thank you very much.